Hey, this is Pastor Josiah Black from Peru First Baptist Church, and we are continuing our ongoing study of the book of Habakkuk. So we are in chapter 3, which is the concluding chapter. Last time we learned that this is a psalm or a hymn or something more uh, inclined towards that kind of composition than the previous two chapters, which were this back and forth between Habakkuk and God. So we're going to continue to look at chapter 3 today. Today we're going to look at the second stanza, which is going to be a much shorter chunk since we looked at last time we looked at the refrain and we looked at the first stanza. So the second stanza begins in verse 9 and it runs through the first half of verse 13. So let's go ahead and read that now. Your bow was made bare, the rods of chastisement were sworn. You cleaved the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and quaked. The downpour of water swept by. The deep uttered forth its voice. It lifted high its hands. Sun and moon stood in their place. They went away at the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming spear. In indignation you marched through the earth. In anger you trampled the nations. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. So that's stanza number 2. If you remember in stanza number 1, we got a lot of stuff about God's power and his sovereignty, and we're continuing to do that here. Some things that should be familiar, that should start to sound, if you've spent time in scripture, that should bring to mind other moments from those stories, other ways that God is talked about in terms of how they attributed and explained and described his power. So we get a lot of nature imagery here, and it's used to contrast with God, to show his power. All this nature stuff is underneath him. That's really important, that right off the bat, okay, look, God is above this stuff. So that's step 1. Because remember, we have a very different experience of our natural world than the ancient people who wrote this would have. At the very least, we like to think we have a very different experience of our natural world. What I mean by that is we understand a lot more about how the world works. Sometimes that leads us to feel more of a sense of understanding or control over it. Whereas these things, as these folks are talking about them, these are for them real primal forces. They might know that the waters flood when it rains a lot, right? But they don't know the mechanism by which rain happens. They might know that sometimes the earth shakes, but they don't know what causes an earthquake. Like, this is all beyond them at this point. And so that should, to us, make this an even more powerful statement about who God is, because there was a reason people in the ancient world who weren't following Yahweh worshipped things like natural forces or attributed those to the gods, because they seemed so big and so beyond that what else could it be but something divine? So for them to take all these things and put God above them, is a really clear statement about how powerful they believe that this God is. Because remember, other gods would have had their power equated with these things. If they might have had a god of the sea, people around them, and whatever the sea could do, that's representative of that God's power. But that deity would never have transcended the sea. It would have never been bigger than the sea. So for Yahweh to be supreme, to be over the sea, to be over the earth, again, we're just doubling down. We're talking about how powerful above he is. So just to get a little more granular here. So the title of this stanza would be, your bow was made bare, the rods of chastisement were sworn. It's really just an introductory statement. It doesn't necessarily describe what's happening in here, but it's really just setting up, an idea, okay? And then that idea here is that after all these things, all these powerful things that God has done in our previous stanza, here we've got a God who is also just, who also corrects, who also interacts with creation in a retributive way, or in a way that is aligned towards justice, if you will. So that's kind of an idea we're trying to capture here. Second part of verse 9, you cleaved the earth with rivers. So that's again acknowledging God as creator. What Habakkuk isn't doing, which he could have very easily done, He's not necessarily referencing specific events in Israel's history. He's, again, just talking big picture. He's just trying to give whoever's hearing this a sense of how mighty and powerful God is. So you cleaved the earth with rivers, which is acknowledgement of God as creator. It's also an acknowledgement, again, of him being Lord over rivers, over the earth. The mountains saw you and quaked. The downpour of waters swept by. The deep uttered forth its voice. It lifted high its hands. So that's, there's a lot going on there, but again, it's very simply intended to be nature imagery that talks about the might and power of God, which I could say that 9 times, and that's gonna pretty tightly define everything we're hearing here. The deep uttered forth its voice. That is either a reference to the deep in the sense of that which dwells under the water, or it's a reference to things deep and beyond human understanding and creation. Regardless of which one it references, God is over them. All right. It lifted high its hands. The point here is that even those things worship and submit to God. So again, we're just reiterating that point. We're hammering it home. Habakkuk's doing this for 2 reasons. Again, it's the first one to tell the reader who Yahweh is. The second one is it's to worship Yahweh, to name him, to declare him as who he is, to testify to his power. That's worship. So that's intended here as well. We can't discard that. It's both things. This would have been both intended to worship God and to instruct whoever was reading it, and hopefully draw them into worship of some kind as well. Sun and moon stood in their places. They went away at the light of your arrows, at the radiance of your gleaming spear. So again, that references things that have happened in the past without getting too specific about it. We know that God caused the sun to stay in the sky at different points. He seemingly, through his power, lengthened the day for Israel when they were in conflict at different points. Light, obviously, is something that's used again and again as imagery to describe God and his power. Both Moses on the mountaintop, how he experienced God, his Shekinah glory, that unrelenting, powerful light that Moses experienced, so much so that his countenance, his face, his self sort of glowed for a while after being in Yahweh's presence. God is bright. He is the source of light as human beings know it and understand it. So this statement of at your radiance, it's essentially, God, you're brighter than the sun. You are more radiant than the sun. So your gleaming spear was such that it overpowered the sun and the moon. So again, subjecting even the cosmos to God. He's not just the God of things here on earth that we mortals see and experience. He's the God of those things up in heaven. Which, remember, to these people at this time, there wasn't a lot of thought here about what those things were. The notion of, okay, our sun is a star among many stars. As far as they knew, there was only one sun. And this was unique, and it was powerful, and it was such a governing force in their lives. And yeah, God was even more powerful than that. So it's a pretty strong statement there. 12, in indignation, you marched through the earth. In anger, you trampled the nations. And then we're going to do 13a here, the first part of 13. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. All right. So of all of this, now look, it's all important. It's scripture, but you can probably hear both in how I've repeated what these things are saying and also in how they sort of seem to be along the same line, that everything leading up to this part of this reading has really just been a testament to God's power. So if we were sort of sifting this, all that stuff would be sifted into a jar that said testimonies about God's power, worshiping God because he's powerful and he's God, okay? 12 and the first half of 13 are a little different. I'm going to read them once more. In indignation, you marched through the earth. In anger, you trampled the nations. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for the salvation of your anointed. So this is important because it speaks to, again, what Habakkuk has been bringing before God. And in a way, it's the start or it's part of a response to what God has told him, okay? So what he means by this, he's calling the people back to a time when God intervened on their behalf. When he did the things that he said he was going to do, he came through. He was indignant about injustice and unrighteousness, so he went to war against it, both directly and using Israel. he trampled the nations, and that would be so here, and this is really interesting, the word is used thresh. And if you'll recall, thresh, it's part of that harvest imagery that we use, that we see in the Old Testament all the time, in a sense about the separation of the wheat and the chaff, things like that, stuff that's intended to imply that God is eliminating the unrighteous, okay? That's relevant here because if you'll recall, Habakkuk's question to God was, why are these Babylonians who are so unrighteous, why are they allowed to stand? So now Habakkuk has heard God's response, and he's again recalling a time where God rose up against the unrighteous. And this is Habakkuk's response because it's essentially him saying, God, I hear you. I'm going to remember fondly those times when you rose up in our favor and you did not allow these things to happen. I trust you that you're going to come through in one way or another, but I also hear what you've told me, and that is that this time you're not going to. So there's a longing here for Habakkuk, a longing for the time when Israel essentially, and this is an oversimplification, but when they were worthy, when God moved in their behalf because they were upholding their end of the covenant, as best they could, versus now where you've got a lot of wickedness, so much so that for God, the most graceful thing he can do is this disruption by the Babylonians. So remember, God always acts from grace and love, even when justice is in the picture. So these things are intended as corrective for Israel. The only thing that can get them back on track is this conflict, this loss to the Babylonians. God's going to use that. But Habakkuk is still longing for a time when they didn't have to do it that way. So he's not laying that at the feet of God. He's not saying, God, you're not doing what you said you'd do. Habakkuk now understands why God is doing what he's doing, or at least as best he can, and he's accepted it. But it's still, it's a lament to some degree. He's lamenting that, God used to be able to do things for us. What he's not saying is he's not doing them now. But that's the implication. So sorry, I know we got a little bit in the weeds there, and I'm sure that how I talked through it probably wasn't the most helpful there. I can, you kind of self-edit these things as you go, but there's a complexity there that's hard for us to understand because we tend to state things more directly, but this is much more of an implied thing, something that's very culturally bound. It's hard for us to fully understand it without spending a lot of time trying to understand Habakkuk as a person existing in Israel at this time, and what it would have been like as a Jewish person at this time, how they would have thought of God, and what kind of sense he would have made from the word he got back from God. So there's a lot in the mix. But if I were to do the long story short version of this, it's that Habakkuk has heard and understood God, that the Babylonians are happening for a reason. God is allowing it. Even though they're not righteous, he's using them. Okay, that's thing number one. Thing number two, Habakkuk accepts it, but he laments it. He's sorry it's happening, and he longs for an older time when God was moving and working on behalf of Israel, and Israel was doing their best to keep the covenant such that God didn't need to take drastic actions like sending the Babylonians to dismantle this thing that they'd corrupted. So that's the too long didn't read sort of summary there. I think that's probably where we're going to leave it today. Next time we'll take a look at the last stanza, talk a little bit more about this, and depending upon how far I'm able to get in a reasonable time frame, we may very well wrap up our study of Habakkuk with the next video. So I think that's probably what we'll do, but I reserve the right to do one more if we need to do one more. So as always, thanks for joining. I'm glad you were able to. I'm glad we're able to study this together, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Take care.